The fluorescent lights hummed their 0200 song, a sound so constant that Sarah Chen's ears had stopped registering it 3 years ago. She moved through Sacred Heart's ER with the kind of invisible efficiency that comes from learning, early, how to take up as little space as possible. 5'2" in faded scrubs that had been washed 200 times, limping slightly on the left side where shrapnel had rearranged her hip joint in ways orthopedic surgeons still didn't fully understand. The name tag read only guest Chen, RN, stripped down, clinical, anonymous. Exactly how she wanted it. The night shift at Sacred Heart ER in Raleigh was a particular kind of controlled chaos. Tuesday nights were quieter than Fridays, the traumas more manageable, the psych holds easier to contain. Sarah had learned the rhythm the way soldiers learn patrol routes, every entrance, every exit, every camera angle, every place where things could go wrong. Bedford had a post-op cardiac patient whose foresight was beginning to infiltrate. She could see it from across the unit. She could also see the way Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat at the physician station without seeing any of it, his attention on his laptop screen, his posture the kind that came from 15 uninterrupted years of nobody telling him no. She moved to the supply cart, pulled a 20-gauge angiocath and a sterile dressing pack, then walked into bed with the movements of someone who had done this motion 10,000 times before. Not careless. Not sloppy. Just automatic. Muscle memory, the kind that came from a different life, a different version of Sarah Chen who had worn different insignia and carried different weight. Her hands were steady as she disconnected the failing for line and established a new one in the dorsal venous network of the patient's right hand. The old woman, Mary, 73, post-op day 2 from a quadruple bypass, barely flinched. Sarah had a touch that made people trust her. She'd never explained why. "You're good at that," Mary said, her voice still foggy from the morphine drip. "Lots of practice," Sarah replied. Standard answer. Not a lie. Just incomplete, the way all her answers were now. She taped the new foresight with hospital corners that would have passed inspection at Fort Benning, then checked the cardiac monitor one more time. Sinus rhythm. Steady. The kind of certainty you could rely on. She pressed her fingers to the inside of her jacket, where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining against her ribs, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Platoon, Sangin Valley emblem so worn the unit designation was barely visible. Her fingers found it the same way they found every foresight in the dark. Automatic. Necessary. A single physical anchor to the version of herself she had learned to bury. "Thank you, dear," Mary said, her eyes drifting closed again. Sarah nodded and stepped out of the room, pulling the curtain closed with precision. The ER was moderately busy for a Tuesday. Bed 1 held a diabetic with blood sugar readings that didn't make sense, 340 milligrams per deciliter, then 90 seconds later a reading of 89. Bad test strip probably. Bed 2 was empty, waiting. Bed 3 held a 20-year-old kid with what looked like a dislocated shoulder from a skateboarding accident, nervous energy radiating off him like heat shimmer. The waiting room held another 6 patients, stacked up like cordwood, each one convinced their particular pain was the most urgent in the city. Dr. Caldwell didn't move from the physician's station. She had learned his patterns the way she had learned everything else, by watching, by noticing, by cataloguing the details that mattered. Caldwell arrived at 1900 for his shift and left at 0700 the next morning with the consistency of a man who had built his entire identity around a title and a schedule. He signed orders without reading them completely. He ignored nurses' suggestions, then implemented them 40 minutes later as his own ideas. He had a habit of referring to the older female nurses as ladies and the younger ones by their first names without permission. He had a way of standing that made the ER feel smaller, like his presence consumed oxygen meant for other people. He'd spent 15 years building his position as Sacred Heart Senior ER attending, his authority reinforced by the framed Johns Hopkins diploma hung at eye level in his office, visible to anyone who had to walk past and feel small by comparison. Sarah had not walked past that office in 3 years. She restocked the forecart, moving through the ritual with the precision of someone running a supply line. Saline flushes. Tegaderm patches. 3 boxes of latex-free gloves because the allergic patient in bed 3 couldn't tolerate the standard ones. She had learned, early in her civilian life, that anticipation was a more valuable skill than reaction time. The military had taught her to wait, to watch, to see the shape of things before they happened. The ER was no different, just smaller stakes, except she had learned not to think about stakes anymore. Thinking about stakes meant thinking about the valley, about the sounds of August heat distorting the air above the FOB, about the weight of the radio handset and the voice coming through it saying, "Major Chen, we've got friendlies down and nobody can reach them," and then the running, the darkness, the moment when her left side stopped working the way it was supposed to. She did not think about stakes. She worked. The cardiac monitor on bed 2 beeped softly, waiting for occupancy. She checked the empty room's vital sign and straightened the blanket on the bed with hospital corners that would have passed a barracks inspection, the kind that looked casual but held firm under any pressure. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed, a sound so constant most people's brains deleted it, but Sarah heard it the way birds hear power line hum. Everything was information. Everything mattered. The way the linoleum floor reflected the light, the position of the emergency crash cart, the bathroom access, the backup exits, the location of the nearest defibrillator pads. She had been taking inventory of rooms since the moment she learned that knowing the details was sometimes the difference between moving forward and moving backward. At 0147, she refilled the 4 medication station, epinephrine, atropine, sodium bicarbonate. The medications of last resorts, the pharmaceutical equivalent of holding the line. She arranged them with alphabetical precision, each vial at a 45-degree angle, easy to grab in the seconds when seconds mattered most. Behind her, in the hallway between trauma bays, she could hear the soft sound of Dr. Caldwell's dress shoes on the tile floor. Italian leather, if she was reading the price point of his life correctly. Expensive. Designed for carpet and hardwood, not hospital floors. He walked like the floor belonged to him, each step a minor claim of territory. She didn't turn around. One of the medical residents, Rodriguez, newer to the team, still eager in the way that burned out quickly in emergency medicine, walked past her carrying a chart. "Sarah, the diabetic in bed 1 is swinging hard. Caldwell wants a repeat glucose check." "Already queued," Sarah said. "Running it now." Rodriguez nodded and moved on. This was how people interacted with her, efficiently, without ceremony, the kind of brief professional exchanges that left no impression and required no follow-up. She preferred it. The less space she took up in people's memories, the safer her past stayed buried. The cardiac monitor in bed 4 beeped its steady rhythm. Mary was sleeping now, post-op pain finally contained, the bypass site healing under the sterile dressing Sarah had placed. She had held people together with less than this, had held people together in ways that civilians with their comfortable lives and their medical degrees hanging on walls couldn't comprehend. She had done things with her hands that had kept men alive who should have been dead. She had made decisions that other people called heroism but she called survival, because the only alternative to saving the life in front of you was letting it die, and she had learned very young that she was not the kind of person who could let that happen and still sleep. But that was the old Sarah. That version had a rank she didn't use anymore. That version wore insignia that meant something specific in the hierarchy of people who understood what it meant to move into danger instead of away from it. That version had a son who wore the same unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket, who had stood in the Sangin Valley with something called a radio and something called orders and something called the belief that his mother would come if he called. She had come. He had not come home. The automatic ER doors hissed open at 0153, and the night shift's comfortable rhythm shatters like glass under a boot. The man who walks through is 6'5", dark-eyed, moving with the kind of intensity that makes the air pressure change, the presence that comes from people who have learned what their bodies are capable of when pushed past the point most people think is breaking. His left hand is pressed against his chest. His breathing is rapid, panicked, the sound of a man whose systems are alarming in ways he doesn't understand. His jacket is torn at the shoulder, and visible beneath it, visible just for a second as he staggers forward, is the faded emblem of a unit patch. Sangin Valley. 2nd Battalion, 3rd Platoon. The same patch sewn against her ribs. Sarah is moving before her brain catches up to her body, the way it learned to do in another lifetime. Around her, the night shift is scattering, Rodriguez backing away, the intern freezing, two of the nursing assistants stepping back toward the safety of the medication station. Everyone moving in the direction of containment, of protocol, of distance. Dr. Caldwell remains sitting at the physician's station, watching with the expression of someone observing furniture. Sarah walks toward the man instead. Tyler Morrison crashes through the automatic doors at 2 in the morning like a building coming down, his massive frame, 6'5", 240, chest heaving, filling the entrance of Sacred Heart's ER with the kind of panic that travels faster than sound. He's clutching his ribs, wild-eyed, hyperventilating in short, jagged bursts that suggest either a cardiac event or something deeper, something his body recognizes as a threat even if his mind can't name it yet. His jacket is torn at the shoulder. Through the rip, the faded green patch of the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment catches the fluorescent light like a prayer someone forgot to finish. 2 nurses sprint for the supply closet. An orderly ducks behind the med cart. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, standing at the physician station with a kind of posture that announces he's never been inconvenienced by an emergency, reaches for the security phone. His fingers hover over the numbers like he's composing a text about someone else's crisis. He's already calculating how this will look on incident reports, how he'll mention it in tomorrow's morning report, how he'll use it somehow to his advantage because men like Caldwell understand that chaos is currency if you know how to spend it correctly. Sarah Chen walks directly toward Morrison with steady hands and a voice that cuts through his panic like a blade through water. "Ranger, I need you to control your breathing. For counts in, for counts out. You're stateside, you're safe, and I'm here to help." The words are measured, professional, but underneath them is something else, something that recognizes the architecture of fear in another person's body because she stood in rooms where that same fear had teeth and took people she loved. Morrison's breathing slows on the 3rd cycle. By the 5th, his shoulders begin to drop from around his ears. Sarah doesn't touch him yet. She lets him find his own equilibrium, gives him the gift of control in a moment when everything feels stolen. She recognizes the Sangin unit patch visible through his torn jacket, the same patch her son wore under Major Chen's command in that blood-soaked valley before the valley took him back. The recognition lands in her chest like shrapnel discovering an old wound. She pushes it down. Right now, Morrison needs a nurse, not a ghost. "What's your name, Ranger?" "Tyler. Tyler Morrison." His voice is still shaking, but there's structure underneath it now, the basic architecture of coherence reasserting itself. "Tyler, I'm Sarah. I need you to walk with me to a bed, and we're going to get you checked out. Can you do that?" He nods. She guides him to the gurney with hands that don't shake, establishing and fall line with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from muscle memory worn into bone. The line slides in clean on the first attempt, 18-gauge angiocath, fluid running through at a steady drip. She runs a 12-lead EKG while a resident who materialized from somewhere finally useful checks his vitals. Blood pressure elevated but dropping. Oxygen sat normal. Heart rhythm regular. The machine's rhythm becomes a second language, one Sarah has been fluent in for longer than she can measure. By 6:40, Tyler Morrison is stable in bed 7, his diagnosis clear, severe panic attack triggered by costochondritis, the inflammation of cartilage in his ribcage creating chest pain that his nervous system had read as cardiac arrest. His wife Jennifer arrives at 4 in the morning with the particular terror of someone who got a call in the dark, and she finds Sarah charting his vitals with the focus of someone who hasn't yet registered relief. "Thank you," Jennifer says, and the words don't feel adequate. "Thank you so much." The other nurses, they didn't know what to do. Sarah nods once. She doesn't mention that staying calm during a crisis is the job, or that recognizing a panic attack versus a true cardiac event is basic assessment. She doesn't mention that she could recognize the specific tenor of Morrison's fear because she's been trained to recognize it in others and, more importantly, in herself. He's going to be fine. Rest will help. Ibuprofen for the inflammation. At 6:30 the next morning, as Sarah charts the night's final entries, Dr. Caldwell enters Morrison's room with 3 medical students in tow. The students are young enough that they still believe medicine is a science. Sarah's already learned it's also a performance, and Caldwell is always looking for a stage. He's dressed impeccably, the kind of tie that costs more than Sarah's monthly car payment, the kind of posture that suggests he's never once considered he might be wrong about anything. "Nurse Chen," he says, his voice loud enough to carry into the hallway, loud enough to ensure that anyone passing bed 7 will remember this moment in the specific way he's engineering it. "Perhaps you can explain to these students why you violated every emergency psychiatric protocol we have in place at this facility." Sarah turns slowly, her face neutral as water. She's been underestimated for long enough that she's learned to use it as camouflage. "I assessed and stabilized the patient, doctor. His vitals are stable. He's resting comfortably." Caldwell's smile is surgical, precise, clean, designed to cut. "You approached an aggressive, potentially violent patient without security backup, without a physician present, and without following the de-escalation protocols that exist to protect staff. Tell me, Nightingale," the nickname lands like a slap, small and mean and intentional, "do the rules simply not apply to you?" Jennifer Morrison stiffens in the chair beside her husband's bed. The medical students examine their shoes with sudden scientific interest. Tyler's jaw tightens, but Sarah's hand on his shoulder keeps him still. One measured breath. That's all she gives herself. Her voice, when it comes, is steady as a surgical laser. "The patient needed immediate intervention. I provided it." Caldwell pulls a printed form from his clipboard. He's prepared for this, which means he came in planning to humiliate her, which means this was never about protocol or patient safety. This was about hierarchy, about a man whose authority she'd inadvertently challenged by saving someone his instinct was to avoid. He tapes the write-up to the corkboard outside Morrison's room where every passing staff member will read it, where the words protocol violations and unauthorized procedures and questionable decision-making will become the narrative that follows her down the hallway. This is a formal write-up. Everyone on this unit needs to understand what happens when we deviate from established procedure. At 8 in the morning, Sarah sits in the break room with her lunch, the container of rice and vegetables she prepared 2 days ago, meals she builds on her days off because eating is logistics and she's good at logistics. One by one, the other nurses gather their food and leave in silence. Maria, who taught her how to insert central lines. James, who covered her shift when her son's death announcement came and she couldn't speak for 3 days. Raina, who she's had coffee with twice a week for a year. They file out like they've been called to somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't include her. Through the break room window, Sarah sees Caldwell watching from the hallway, his smirk deliberate as a signature. He's counting something, probably the number of people who've abandoned her, probably calculating how the isolation will compound itself over days, how loneliness becomes self-fulfilling, how silence is a more effective punishment than any formal discipline. He doesn't expect what happens next. She meets his eyes directly and speaks clearly enough for the remaining tech to hear every word. "Courage isn't something you can write up, doctor." One tear escapes as she turns away, not from fear, not from hurt, but from the exhaustion of carrying secrets in a place where everyone claims to be in the business of saving lives. She wipes it without breaking stride, without acknowledging it, without giving Caldwell the satisfaction of seeing her break. His jaw tightens. The quiet defiance is worse than shouting. It makes him look petty, and more importantly, it makes her look composed, and both of them understand that in a hospital, in any hierarchy, composure is its own form of power. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next week, Caldwell moves with calculated precision that suggests he's thought about this for longer than the hours since her statement in the break room. He reassigns Sarah's most experienced techs, Maria and James, who've worked with her for 2 years, citing development opportunities that scatter them to day shift rotation she won't see. He alters her schedule to maximize isolation, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday nights paired with the newest, least trained staff, people who don't yet understand how to work together, people who still freeze during codes. A carefully worded memo restricts her access to Morrison's room, citing patient care continuity and assigning his case exclusively to Dr. Reeves. Sarah finds each change posted on the unit board, each one bureaucratically unassailable, each one a small surgical strike against her presence on this unit. Morrison asks for her twice. Both times, other nurses deliver messages that Dr. Caldwell said she's unavailable. The isolation is systematic, methodical, designed not just to hurt her but to make her invisible in a way that compounds every shift she works. On Thursday night, she treats a teenage motorcycle accident while working with a tech who froze during the initial assessment. On Saturday, she runs a code with a medical student who couldn't find the crash cart. The experienced nurses avoid eye contact. Caldwell's influence reaches everywhere: the scheduling system, the supply requisitions, even the break room coffee fund. On Sunday, Morrison's wife Jennifer approaches Sarah in the parking lot at shift change, the sun breaking through Carolina clouds in that particular way that makes everything look like a beginning instead of an ending. "Tyler keeps asking for you," Jennifer says quietly. "He says you understood what he was going through. He wants to thank you properly." Sarah's hand moves to the jacket lining where the faded unit patch sits against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The Sangin patch. Her son's patch, the one she cut from a uniform that came back without him. "Tell him I'm glad he's recovering." That's thanks enough. Jennifer hesitates. "He mentioned something about Sangin. About recognizing your presence." Sarah's face remains neutral, but her hand trembles once, just once, before she steadies it through sheer discipline and years of practice at keeping things locked down. "I need to go, Mrs. Morrison. I'm glad your husband is safe." She drives away before Jennifer can ask the question forming on her lips, before anyone can ask why a nurse's hands would shake at the mention of a valley on the other side of the world, before the truth she's buried deeper than graves finds oxygen and starts burning. That evening, Caldwell makes 3 phone calls. The first is to Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who owes him for a recommendation letter that got her promoted to department head. The second is to board chair Richard Tompkins, who he plays golf with monthly at the club where they discuss money and influence in ways that never appear in writing. The third is to hospital administrator Janet Corcoran, who values hierarchy and protocol above all else, who believes that the strong rise and the weak fall and that this is simply natural selection in scrubs. "I need a favor," he tells each of them. "There's a nurse who's becoming a liability." The week that followed moved with the precision of a calculated military operation, except Caldwell was the only one executing a strategy. Sarah didn't see it coming, not the way it unfolded, layered and deliberate, each move designed to isolate her completely from the support network she'd quietly built during her 12 months at Sacred Heart. Monday morning, Caldwell called Maria Santos into his office at 0700 before the day shift fully arrived. Maria had been Sarah's anchor, the senior tech who'd worked alongside her on the night shift for 8 months, the one who'd learned to anticipate Sarah's needs without words, the one who'd seen her genuine smile exactly twice. Caldwell sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled, the picture of benevolent leadership. "Maria, I've noticed your exceptional skill set. I'd like to develop you further. Starting this week, you're moving to the surgical wing. Better advancement opportunities. Better pay. This is a gift, really." Maria had wanted to protest. She'd heard the coded message in his tone, understood what was happening to Sarah, but Caldwell had already begun reviewing her transfer paperwork. By Monday afternoon, she was gone. James Chen, the day shift tech who'd worked 3 overlapping shifts with Sarah, received an identical offer Tuesday morning, emergency room rotation at Duke University Hospital, a prestigious placement that looked impossible to refuse. "They specifically requested you," Caldwell had said, pushing the letter across his desk. James had called Sarah during break, his voice tight. "I'm sorry." I don't know how he found out, but Sarah had cut him off before he could finish. "It's not your choice anymore. Go. Duke's a good opportunity." She'd meant it. She wasn't going to let Caldwell's strategy cost James anything. By Wednesday, Sarah's schedule had transformed into a masterpiece of isolation. Caldwell had rewritten the night shift assignments, spreading her shifts to overlap with day staff she'd never worked with, eliminating her connection to the evening crew she'd developed relationships with. Thursday night she was paired with 2 per diem nurses who'd never seen her before, who didn't know how to read her movements, who followed protocols like scripture rather than guidelines. Friday night, worse, she was assigned to a different unit entirely, post-op recovery instead of the emergency department. The message was clear without being spoken: you are being erased. But the real stroke came through interdepartmental memos, each one worded with clinical precision. Caldwell began restricting her access to Tyler Morrison's room, the patient she'd saved, the reason Caldwell had decided she was a threat. The first memo arrived in her inbox Thursday morning. Nurse Chen, per patient care continuity protocols, Mr. Morrison's recovery requires consistent provider relationships established during his initial admission. His chart will be managed by day-shift nursing staff exclusively. This is to ensure seamless care transition and reduce confusion during his critical stabilization phase. Dr. M. Caldwell, emergency medicine physician. She'd read it 3 times, the language so carefully constructed that it sounded reasonable. Almost kind, even. Patient care continuity. Seamless transition. The words that meant, stay away from him. Sarah continued working. That was what she did. She moved through the hospital corridors with the same invisible efficiency she'd perfected over the years, took her assignments without comment, executed her protocols with precision, spoke only when necessary. But now she was doing it entirely alone. The nurses who'd started nodding to her in the hallway stopped making eye contact. The tech who'd brought her coffee during break shifts found reasons to work other floors. Dr. Reeves, who'd examined Morrison's improvised chest seal with something that might have been respect, stopped attending the morning briefings where Sarah would have been present. The pressure built like a pneumothorax, steady, imperceptible at first, then impossible to ignore. She'd survived combat deployments where support came in the form of radio chatter and knowing your squad had your back. She'd survived the transition to civilian life by becoming someone nobody noticed, someone so invisible that her past couldn't catch up with her. But invisibility required at least the presence of other people around you. Caldwell had engineered a new version. She was visible enough to isolate, invisible enough that nobody would witness or care. Wednesday night, she'd checked on Tyler Morrison's room without permission, just walking past his door on her way to the supply room on the post-op floor. He was sleeping, his color better, his chest moving with the rhythm of someone whose lungs were fully inflated again. Jennifer Morrison sat in the corner chair, her head tilted back against the wall, asleep. Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. By Friday, something had shifted in the hospital air. The story had spread in that way hospital gossip spreads, distorted, half-remembered, dangerous. Sarah had violated protocol. Sarah had performed an unauthorized procedure. Sarah was the reason they were all going to have to sit through new training on what constituted the scope of nursing practice. The other nurses whispered it in the break room, and Sarah simply took her lunch to the parking lot instead, eating a sandwich in her car, tasting nothing, feeling the cold October wind move across her face like a reminder of what she'd lost. That Friday morning, Caldwell had walked past her in the corridor. She was restocking the supply cart on post-op, alone as always, and he'd smiled. It wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man executing a flawless strategy, watching pieces move exactly where he positioned them. Good work this week, Nurse Chen, he'd said quietly, so no one else would hear. You're settling into your new assignments nicely. Looks like you're finding your level. She'd held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back at the supplies. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. Yes, doctor. That was all. That was enough. He walked away satisfied, and Sarah continued restocking the cart with the same methodical precision she'd used to break down a weapon. Each item placed exactly where it belonged. Each action purposeful. Each moment a small funeral for something that was dying, not her will, not her strength, but the careful life she'd built here, the 12-month reconstruction that had finally made her believe she could disappear into something like normalcy. The week continued this way, each day another layer of isolation, another subtle exclusion, another moment of understanding that Caldwell had learned her weakness and weaponized it. Not violence. Not confrontation. Something quieter and more devastating, the systematic removal of connection, the professional equivalent of watching someone slowly suffocate. He was pushing her toward something. Toward a breaking point. Toward a moment where she'd make a mistake or speak up or do something that would give him exactly what he needed to justify what was coming next. Sarah recognized the pattern because she'd seen it in combat, the way an enemy systematically cut off supply routes, eliminated communication, forced you into worse and worse positions until you had to act. Caldwell was doing the same thing, except his battlefield was a hospital in Raleigh, and his weapons were policy memos and schedule changes and the calculated cruelty of institutional power. By Sunday night, when she returned for her Monday shift, she'd made a decision she didn't remember making. She would wait. She would continue working. She would remain professional and invisible. And when the moment came, because it would come, because Caldwell wouldn't stop until he'd moved his final piece, she would be ready. Her hands would be steady. Her mind clear. Her composure intact. She didn't know yet that the moment was less than 48 hours away. She didn't know that Tyler Morrison would crash at 0243 on Tuesday morning, his lung collapsing again, his oxygen saturation plummeting toward death. She didn't know that Caldwell had already written the email that would end her career, had already spoken to the board members who owed him favors, had already decided that her one act of unauthorized heroism was going to be the thing that destroyed everything. But some part of her, the part that had trained in the Sangin Valley, that had learned how to move through chaos, that had developed a sixth sense for when violence was coming, or recognized that the quiet before the storm wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a predator circling. And she was the prey. Tuesday night at 0243, the monitor above Tyler Morrison's bed started screaming. Sarah heard it from the hallway, not the soft algorithmic beeping of routine vitals, but the shriek of a system in acute distress. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. Combat response. The thing that 12 years of training had wired into her nervous system couldn't be unlearned by folding scrubs and wearing a name badge. She was in his room in 3 strides. Morrison's oxygen saturation was collapsing. The number on the monitor read 68% and dropping like a stone through water. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps. His skin had gone the color of old concrete. The ventilator was running, but something inside his chest had catastrophically failed. Pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. Sarah didn't call for help. That was the mistake civilians made. They called out, waited, explained their reasoning while a human being died in front of them. She moved. Her hands found the ventilator bag. She squeezed, forcing oxygen into Morrison's lungs manually, watching his numbers like she was reading coordinates off an artillery map. 75%. 68 again. 61. The lung wasn't expanding. Whatever was happening inside his chest cavity was preventing his lungs from filling. The monitor screamed louder. "I need a needle." 14 gauge minimum, she said, her voice flat and clinical. The residents froze in the doorway. They weren't used to nurses giving orders. But her voice carried the weight of someone who'd issued commands while rounds were coming down range. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A statement of necessary fact. No one moved. Sarah didn't wait. She found the crash cart herself, located the 14 gauge needle with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in worse conditions. The equipment felt like coming home in her hands. Cold. Sterile. Honest. Equipment didn't care about protocols or hierarchy, it cared about function. She found the second intercostal space on Morrison's chest, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical point. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. The needle went in perpendicular to his rib cage, through the skin, through the muscle, through the fascia, until the hiss of air escaping from his lung cavity told her she was exactly where she needed to be. The sound was like letting pressure out of a tire. His saturation jumped. 62 to 71 to 82. The monitor found its rhythm again. His breathing eased from frantic gasping into something approximating normal respiration. But that wasn't the worst part. That procedure, the needle decompression, the anatomical knowledge, the absolute certainty in her movements, that was classified training. That was combat medic documentation. That was Major Sarah Chen, Army Ranger medic, not Sarah Chen, night shift nurse at Sacred Heart ER in Raleigh. The resident stared at her. "How did you?" "Emergency protocols," Sarah said quietly. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't explain. She checked Morrison's vitals one more time, watched the oxygen saturation hold steady, and began removing her gloves with methodical precision. Each glove peeled away like she was shedding a layer of something. The situation was stable. Morrison would live. The crisis was contained. The cover wasn't. She stepped out of his room at 0247, her hands moving through the motions of charting without shaking. This was composure. This was what separating the nerves from the actions looked like. This was survival. At 0251, her phone vibrated in her scrub pocket. A text from an unknown number: "You just made a very serious mistake." Dr. Caldwell didn't call the night shift supervisor. He didn't file an incident report through standard channels. At 0315, while Sarah was still in the ER, he made the first phone call to a hospital board member named Fitzgerald who owed him a favor from a consulting contract signed 3 years ago. At 0332, before Sarah finished her shift, he made the second call to the Medical Licensing Board's peer review coordinator, a man named Hayes who'd hired Caldwell's sister-in-law into a hospital administration position in Charlotte. By 0400, when Sarah clocked out, the third call was already in motion. Caldwell calling someone with access to sealed federal records. Someone in a position to know things about military service files that civilian doctors shouldn't possess. Someone with questions about where a night shift nurse in Raleigh, North Carolina had really acquired combat-level medical training. The calls were quiet. Professional. Deniable. Morrison woke at 0530, his breathing steady, his crisis managed. His wife Jennifer stood beside his bed, holding his hand, when he turned his head slightly and found Sarah entering his room for the final check of her shift. "You saved my life," Morrison whispered. His voice carried the fragility of a man who'd just stared down his own extinction. "Again?" Sarah adjusted his full line without responding. This was protocol. This was what a nurse did. But Morrison wouldn't let it go. "I know what you did," he continued. "I've seen that procedure once. In Sangin. Major Chen was running casualty collection when we got hit." His eyes found hers. "Major Sarah Chen saved my life in Sangin, and her son died getting me out." Sarah's hands paused on the foredrip for exactly 1 second. That was all the reaction she allowed herself. 1 second. The smallest fracture in the facade. "Get some rest," she said, and turned to leave. "Thank you," Morrison called after her. "Tell me how to thank you properly." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because gratitude was a luxury for people without secrets, and Sarah Chen had been carrying secrets so long they felt like organs, essential, invisible, and absolutely necessary to survival. But the secret was out now. Morrison knew. He'd said her rank out loud in a hospital room while his wife listened. And Caldwell was making phone calls. The predator circling had detected blood in the water. At 0715 that morning, Sarah arrived for her shift at Sacred Heart. The day supervisor met her at the entrance, her expression deliberately neutral. "Dr. Caldwell wants to see you in his office. Now." The office was austere. Caldwell sat behind his desk like a general at a court-martial, his hands folded on top of something she could see but not yet read. Termination papers. The yellow tabs flagged each page like warnings. "Sarah," he began, his voice clinical as a scalpel. "We need to discuss your conduct during the Morrison emergency last night." "Mr. Morrison's condition stabilized," Sarah said quietly. "Through a procedure that violates every protocol we have in place," Caldwell replied. His eyes were cold, not angry, but something colder. Satisfaction. He'd been waiting for this moment. A needle decompression of that sophistication, performed by a night shift nurse without physician authorization, without consultation, without proper documentation. It's exactly the kind of reckless decision-making I warned the staff about after your de-escalation incident. Sarah didn't respond. She watched him slide the termination papers across his desk, each one printed with her name, her position, the words "effective immediately." "You have violated core protocols repeatedly," Caldwell continued, reading from prepared notes. "Your approach to patient care demonstrates questionable decision-making that endangers both patients and staff. This hospital cannot continue employing someone whose judgment is this severely compromised." She signed the papers with steady hands. Each signature was controlled. Not defeated. Not broken. Just accepting that this particular battle had been lost to someone playing a longer game than she'd anticipated. "You saved his life," Sarah said quietly, not as a question but as an observation. "That's what bothers you most." Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I saved his life through proper procedure and consultation with specialists. You performed an unauthorized operation and created a liability nightmare." "The authorized procedure would have taken 4 minutes longer," Sarah said, her voice dropping into something older. Something that had commanded ranges in the sand. His oxygen saturation was at 61%. 4 minutes gets you a code, a crash cart, maybe a funeral. I recognized the emergency signature and responded with the training I had available." "Someone with your background," Caldwell said, glancing at notes on his desk that made her blood temperature drop by several degrees, "should understand the absolute importance of following the chain of command. Of respecting institutional hierarchy." The implication hung in the sterile air between them like a blade. He'd been digging into her sealed records, pulling information he had no legal right to access. And he was letting her know it. Sarah stood. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath you take before entering a room where people are trying to kill you. "Some orders exist to protect power, Doctor," she said quietly. "Others exist to protect people. The difference matters. Even if you never learned it." She walked out past the day shift nurses, their faces carefully constructed into professional blankness. Sympathy was a luxury none of them could afford. Association with her was now contamination. That evening, Sarah drove to Sacred Heart during the shift change at 1900 hours, when the laundry facilities would be empty. Her scrubs were folded in her locker exactly where she'd left them, 3 sets, washed and dried over 3 years of night shifts, the faded Sacred Heart logos barely visible on the breast pockets. She ran them through the dryer one final time. The heat rumbled like distant helicopters. When the cycle finished, she folded each set with precision, hospital corners, the way she'd been taught in a desert base 12 years ago by a sergeant major who died before the decade was out. Each crease felt like a funeral. This was the life she'd rebuilt after Sangin. After the shrapnel. After watching her son's flag-draped coffin loaded onto a C-130 Hercules while she stood in dress uniform, her hands at her sides, her face a mask that had taken 20 years to construct. She'd come to Raleigh to become someone new. Someone invisible. Someone who didn't carry the weight of 13 deployments and the names of 47 soldiers who hadn't made it home. She placed the folded scrubs in the donation bin for new nurses, smoothed the top set once, and then touched the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining. The patch was worn nearly transparent from decades of contact, but the insignia was still visible if you knew how to look. Her unit. Her command. The rangers she'd trained. The valley where her son had made his last stand. When she walked out of Sacred Heart at 1945 hours, she didn't look back. Morrison's words echoed through her head like a transmitted radio signal. "Major Sarah Chen saved my life in Sangin, and her son died getting me out." She'd asked him not to say it. Now she wondered if he was the kind of soldier who listened, or the kind who had to see things burn before he understood the price. At 0700, the office was already cold. Sarah walked in expecting her schedule. Instead, Dr. Caldwell sat behind his desk with termination papers laid out in a perfect line, yellow flag tabs marking each signature page like tiny accusations. He didn't stand. Didn't offer coffee or a chair. Just gestured to the seat across from him the way you'd gesture to a defendant. Repeated protocol breaches, he said, sliding the first document across polished mahogany. His voice carried the clinical precision of someone reading a grocery list. Unauthorized procedures. Decision-making that endangered patient safety and undermined unit authority. Sarah's eyes moved across the paper without focusing. The words were already written. The decision was already made. She'd known this was coming since Morrison crashed, and her hands moved on muscle memory she was never supposed to have. Someone with your pattern of questionable judgment, Caldwell continued, has no place at Sacred Heart. We have standards. Hierarchy. Protocol exists for a reason, to protect patients and maintain the integrity of this department. He leaned back in his chair, and Sarah heard the leather creak like a gunshot in the silence. You can leave your badge on my desk. Your access card will be deactivated by noon. Security will escort you out. 3 sentences. That's all it took to end the life she'd rebuilt. She didn't speak. Didn't ask for an explanation or a chance to appeal. There was nothing to say to a man who saw threat instead of competence, who measured value in hierarchy instead of lives saved. She just picked up the termination papers, folded them once, and held them the way you hold something fragile that's already broken. The drive home was silent except for the radio she didn't turn on. Raleigh unfolded around her, the same streets she'd driven for 3 years, the same coffee shops she'd never entered, the same grocery store where she'd learned to walk through crowds without being seen. All of it designed to be invisible. All of it erased in a single morning. Morrison's words kept echoing, Major Chen saved my life in Sangin, and her son died getting me out. The truth she'd never spoken aloud. The reason she'd walked away from everything, her rank, her identity, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the grave in Arlington where her son had been buried under a flag her hands had held steady as the folding team worked. She'd taken a medical discharge citing PTSD and spinal injury, both true, but incomplete. She'd disappeared into the night shift, into scrubs and invisibility, thinking she could outrun what she'd lost by becoming someone new. But Morrison had recognized the patch. Morrison's hands had trembled when he saw her across that chaotic ER, and she'd known in that moment that silence was never going to hold. That evening, she returned to Sacred Heart through the employee entrance. The laundry room was empty. Industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm. She pulled her scrubs from her locker one last time, 6 sets, all identical, all wrinkled from the dryer. The fabric was still warm. She began to fold them. 1 crease. 2. The motions were identical to folding field gear after 19 years of service. The same precise angles. The same muscle memory. Each fold felt like a small funeral for the nurse she'd pretended to be, for the woman who'd walked these corridors believing invisibility was survival, that hiding was healing, that silence could hold the weight of everything she'd lost. The 3rd set of scrubs. She paused. Pressed the fabric against her chest where the unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining. The edges of it had frayed. The colors had faded. But it was still there, proof that she had been something before she became nothing. That she had commanded respect before she'd learned to be overlooked. That her hands had held lives together in a blood-soaked valley in Helmand Province before they learned to push medications in a North Carolina ER. She finished folding. Stacked the scrubs in the locker. Closed the door one final time. The hallway outside was quiet. Night shift was ending. Day shift staff moved past in 1s and 2s, already knowing not to acknowledge her. Word had traveled. Sarah Chen was being walked out. Sarah Chen was the problem Caldwell had identified and eliminated. Sarah Chen was just a nurse after all, competent enough to work weekends, not important enough to protect. She passed the unit board where her write-up still hung, yellowed now, curling at the edges. Protocol violations. Unauthorized procedures. Questionable judgment. The words Caldwell had chosen meant to diminish, to make her look like a liability instead of what she actually was, a woman who'd survived 19 years of combat, who'd held her son's hand through deployments, who'd buried him at Arlington under a flag she'd earned with her own blood, and who'd continued forward anyway, not because she was strong, but because the alternative was to lie down in the grave beside him. She walked past it without stopping. The parking lot was still dark. Her car sat where she'd left it this morning, 17 hours ago, before the world had decided she wasn't safe enough to keep. Before protocol had mattered more than her hands. Before invisibility had finally failed her completely. Her phone began to ring as she reached for the ignition. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again immediately. Then a text, "This is Captain Walsh, 75th Ranger Regiment. We need to talk." Another call. Another message, "Sarah, it's Rodriguez. We found you." Her hand stilled on the steering wheel. The phone kept ringing. One after another, like waves approaching shore, each one carrying a name from the life she'd left behind. Soldiers she'd served with. Rangers she'd commanded. The brotherhood she'd thought she'd severed when she'd signed the medical discharge and disappeared into the night shift. Morrison had made calls. Of course he had. The Sangin unit patch was a classified designation. You didn't see that symbol unless you'd walked in that valley. Unless you'd lost people there. Unless you'd earned it with something more than courage, with the willingness to bleed for it. The phone rang again. She didn't answer. She just sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, listening to the voicemails pile up, watching the messages accumulate like snow, understanding in that moment that invisibility had never been a choice. It had always been a countdown. An expiration date. A lie she could only maintain for so long before the truth, her truth, came walking through the doors looking for her. If you're just joining us, the entire story of Sarah Chen starts from segment 1. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens when the military finally shows up at Sacred Heart. Have you ever hidden who you really are to survive? Tell me in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who deserves recognition for invisible heroism. And join our community of people who believe the quietest warriors often carry the heaviest weight. Thanks for watching.